This is the 3.5 gallon version of the American Standard Madera toilet, introduced around the early 1980s and would be made up until around 1996. This is another one of those cases where a good toilet could have been had, but there are some major drawbacks to said particular good toilet, so let's talk about it. The overall design of this toilet is nothing really to write home about. It's pretty basic, honestly. Trapway opening is more or less similar to the Cadet, but honestly has a plate-like look to it, as you can kind of tell. Let's have a look at a flush. Honestly, all things considered, these things are pretty great flushes. But the problem is that the siphons are very, very inconsistent. Sometimes these don't even siphon out at all. And I don't know why that particularly is the case, considering that the 3.5 Cadet doesn't really have that much of a problem siphoning out most of the time. But the 3.5 Madera, on the other hand, has problems siphoning out, and I just don't get it. Another major problem is that these things are also known for having pretty inconsistent pulls as well, often leading to some shredding issues, somehow even worse than the 3.5 Cadet, which the 3.5 Cadet is kind of 50-50 with its pulling and siphon power, but this is definitely a lot worse, unfortunately. Another downgrade compared to the 3.5 Cadet is the performance. It's just okay. Nothing I've really had a problem with, but these things are known for clogging every now and then. Thankfully not as much as you might think, but still a problem nonetheless, compared to the unstoppable performance of the 3.5 Cadet on Flushometer. Which is kind of a shame, honestly. That was a missed opportunity. Now let's have a look at ball rims. Honestly, the ball rinse is not bad. I will note that some areas do look a little bit scuffed when it comes to rinsing, but this thing does have angled rim jets, which is a plus. And that is the 3.5 gallon version of the American Standard Madera toilet. Honestly, there was a lot of good that this thing could have had, but there are some drawbacks that just kind of draw this thing back a good little bit from being a fairly good toilet compared to the 3.5 Cadet. I wouldn't say it's outright terrible, but man, this thing could have had so much more. But let's grade it.
Well, the overall design of this toilet is nothing to really write home about. It does have its own design, but again, it's just very plain. I'm giving it a 5. The quality control for the most part is okay. It's not the best, but I've definitely seen worse. The main issues I've noticed with the quality control is mostly the shredding issues as well as the weird performance issues. But those are two things I'll touch up on later. Outside of that, everything else seems to work just fine. But overall, I'm giving it a 6. Consistency is mostly fine. However, I have noticed a few that do look like American Standard plebes, which is a bit weird. Ignoring that though, it gets a 7. The Trapway design is just okay. The opening looks pretty decently sized, but the main issue I've noticed is that it's a wall trapway. And that might explain why the performance is not that great. I give it a 6. The flush overall is pretty great. I like how nice and powerful the flush is on most of these. Even on lower pressures, the flush ends up still being pretty good. However, these things do have siphoning issues sometimes. Not all the time, but it's kind of split. Due to that, the most I can give this is an 8. So, the pulling and siphon power is significantly worse than the 3.5 Cadet on Flushometer. Now, the 3.5 Cadet does have some pulling and siphon issues, mostly with the pulling factor, as it can be pretty 50-50 with its shredding problem. But it's significantly a little bit worse on the Madera, and I think I have an explanation why. I noticed with older swirly toilets, they tend to have two issues most of the time. One is that the pulling factor isn't really activated until the very end of the flush. You'll notice this particular problem with toilets like the standard Afton or even the Crane Worrelton. The second issue is that the swirl pretty much overpowers the flush and doesn't really get pulled down until the very end of the flush. Very similar to the first one, but it's really more of the swirl overpowering everything. Now, not every swirly flushometer toilet has this particular problem, but it's definitely a trend I've been noticing with some older toilets, and something I'm going to be bringing up a lot more in future videos. If this thing is more like medium pressure, I think this thing would do alright, but most of these tend to be pretty overpowered, so good luck with that. And not to mention the siphoning issues. Overall, I have to give this a 4. The performance for the most part is just okay. It's not the worst in the world, but in comparison to the 3.5 Cadet on Flushometer, it is definitely a downgrade. And I definitely think I have a reason why. The walled trapway. Something I've noticed is that walled trapways tend to perform a lot worse compared to sloped trapways. The 3.5 Madera, while not terrible, definitely has some issues every now and then. Meanwhile, the 3.5 Cadet on Flushometer is practically unstoppable. That tells you a lot right there. It's getting a 6. The bow rinse is pretty decent overall. While I definitely think some coverage could have been a little bit better, I do like how it has angled ram jets and covers most of the area pretty well. There are some areas that could have used some improvement, but overall it's definitely a lot better compared to some other toilets out there. I give it a 7. Despite the problems I mentioned with this toilet, the survivability is pretty decent. Most of these I've seen out in the wild are still there to this very day. Even though this thing isn't perfect, this thing can definitely hold its own, and I'm definitely not going to deny that. It gets a 7. Now let's talk about the overall value of this toilet. Overall, this thing does have some pretty interesting design choices and some ideals, but the execution was a little bit more questionable to say the least. This thing has some pretty cool ideals like the flush and the bow rinse, but some things like the pulling factor and even the performance do leave a lot to be desired. In comparison to the 3.5 Cadet on Flushometer, this thing is just a little bit lackluster. This thing definitely had some interesting ideas, but I definitely think they could have tested it a lot more before they released it. Overall, it's getting a 6 in value. The final score of the 3.5 gallon American Standard Madera toilet is a 62 out of 100. This is definitely one of the more interesting toilets that American Standard has made, and definitely had some pretty cool ideals, but the execution was a little bit choppy to say the least. It's far from the worst toilet ever made, as there's so much worse out there, but I felt like they could have done a little bit more with this toilet. As in comparison to the 3.5 Cadet on Flushometer, it's just lackluster.